Can you hear me?
I can, Ajarn. We're live. Hello, and welcome to a conversation about Buddhism and what happens when we die, a Buddhist perspective on death and dying. My name's Matt Habermehl, and I'm very privileged to be speaking today to Pra Ajarn Maha Supha from Wat Pra Asawa Hamarem in Thailand. We don't like to talk about death much, and we seem to instinctively avoid reminding ourselves that our lives will end. When I was a young boy, I remember thinking that it was just so inconceivable that my consciousness could just stop. But then I thought about deep sleep, and I realized that there would be little difference between a dreamless sleep and unconsciousness and death, at least from a first-person subjective point of view. Others believe that their consciousness does survive death and goes on into an afterlife. I'm not sure which idea is more consoling, to be honest. But whatever happens after death, death itself is the only certainty in life other than taxes. And I'm privileged today to speak to Pra Ajarn Maha Supha, a Buddhist monk in the Thai forest tradition, who will share a perspective, Buddhist perspectives on death and dying. Ajarn, welcome.
My great honor to talk with you again, Matt.
Thank you. Sawati Krap. And I know you had caught a little bit of a cold, so please forgive us if there's any coughing or anything in the meantime.
I've been in court. I got caught for a week, perhaps because we are going to talk about death and dying, so that's why I get caught. So it's a signal that we are close to death and dying.
Well, I'm glad you're not dead yet, Ajarn.
Hopefully it's not become like COVID-19. It's just regular season flu.
Yes, I hope so.
Okay, go ahead.
So, Ajarn, I wanted to talk to you today about death and dying. And this is something that a lot of us avoid thinking about on a regular basis because it's uncomfortable. But I understand that there is some value in reflecting on death and dying. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit from the Buddhist perspective about the value of actually reflecting on death and dying, thinking about it.
Well, death or dying is considered to be one of the biggest form of suffering in our life. Nobody can avoid it. It's real. It's part of life. It's similar to final exams for a student. If you are a student, say at university levels or high school levels, and then at the end of your school, you have to go, I believe you have to go to final exams, which is the most important exams for every student. And what if you are not well prepared?
Well, then we would fail.
Well, not only fail, but a lot of negative consequences.
Right.
For your future life.
And this is what I find very interesting is the idea that death is like a final exam. It's very different than a lot of the ideas that come out of the Western traditions.
Right. So if we make a comparison about that to final exams, life to final exam is so crucial. So if we try to avoid not reflect on this kind of reality, we will get a very, very negative result. Let's give you another example. In the beginning stage of COVID-19 spread to North America, I heard the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, say, relax, Nothing serious. No deadly virus. It will go anyhow. This is what he said. And then after that, what will happen, Matt? Many people die. In in comparison with China, the original sources of COVID-19, they are well prepared. They are aware that this is deadly virus. So few die in China in comparison with this state. So, so if you are not well prepared with something real that is going to happen to you, we will get a lot of, I think, negative consequences. Now, from I heard, more than perhaps more than 2 million people die from COVID-19 alone. And but eventually, now we have 7 billion people in the world. Eventually, all of them will die. No exceptions. So death and dying is real. We cannot avoid. So if we cannot avoid, eventually we have to face. So we should prepare ourselves. This is I think this is the benefit, the first benefit of reflection on death and dying. So it allows us to be well prepared.
When we think oftentimes about preparing ourselves for death, we would think about becoming comfortable with the idea, which none of us know how we're going to deal with it until we're facing it.
Right.
But I think in Buddhism, the preparation for death is a little bit different than just becoming comfortable with the idea. Is that right?
Right. In Buddhism, particular, the Buddha told his disciple to reflect on death and dying every minute. Not one time a year, not one time 6 months, or not one time a day, but every minute. That's what he said. You have to contemplate on death and dying in every minute, every single walk of your life, because it's a real. He said it's a real. So if you don't reflect on death and dying very often, you are negligent. You are negligent, and this, I think, this is one benefit of reflection of death and dying. It allows us to have a well prepared to deal with this kind of reality, which is going to happen to everyone, no exception. Whether you become great power, empire, king, military power, or whoever you are, they don't care. Death and dying don't care you. So when death and dying is real, and when is the thing that we have to face. So we have no option. So we should try to understand about this kind of reality, so that we can have the right attitude when we are crossing to death or dying. I think this is one biggest benefits of reflection on death and dying. And another benefit, which is I believe little people be aware that the idea of mindfulness meditation, or the idea of insight meditation, and on bunch of meditation, which is the people in the West very, very popular in the West now. You know what? fundamentally come from reflection on death and dying.
Right. Historically.
Yes, come from the man named Siddhartha Gautama. He was a prince, and he is the first man who seriously reflecting about death and dying. He asked a fundamental question when he saw dying people. He asked the question, why we die, where death come from.
What did he discover? I mean, there's a lot of different ways to think about why we die, like car crashes, cancer, senescence, old age, that kind of thing. Is that kind of what he was thinking about?
Yes, first of all, because he was a prince. According to the story, his father tried to prevent him to see dying people. But eventually, his father couldn't stop him, couldn't prevent him. And then he saw a dying person. And then he come to the very, very critical question about where death come from and how it's arising. And then eventually he saw aging people. And then he think that because of aging, there is death. So death come from aging. But he is the man who keep seeking the root cause. And then he asked, what is the cause of aging? So it doesn't seem to arising spontaneously. It must come from some cause and condition. And eventually, one occasion, he saw a woman giving a birth. And then he think that aging come from birth. So if we are not born, we will not get aging. Then if we don't get aging, we will not die. And then he keep going on that should have some cause and condition for birth. Birth doesn't arising spontaneously. But in that time, because he was a prince, he tried to ask everyone in his king palace, but could not get any satisfactory answer about why we come to the world, why we are born. Because when you ask the question, why we are born, why we come to the world, you reach the unknown territory, which is called consciousness.
See, this is interesting because from a Western scientific point of view, we would think, well, we're born because some cells come together in conception and they multiply and eventually turn into a fetus and then a baby. And, so we have this very causal, materialistic understanding. And very few people think that there is a need for any other explanation, any other understanding of causes or conditions. Is that a wrong-headed way? Is that erroneous? Is that perspective incomplete somehow?
This is what I feel from a Buddhist perspective. For Western scientists, they look only from biological factors. They ignore the idea of consciousness before birth. They have no idea. Also, the prince, Siddhartha Gautama, before he decided to become a monk, also have no idea about the cause of birth. I think perhaps he went to ask scientists in his time, and scientists said no, nothing beyond biological factors. But he doesn't seem to get satisfied answer, because when he saw people, if only a biological factor, people should be the same, but they have many different personality. Even people who are born in the same family, in the same dad at the same time, they have a very different personality. So if only biological factors, how they are going to different? I mean, in terms of twin, right? Twin.
Yeah, so if you have twins and they turn out to have slightly different personalities or very different personalities,
Yes.
Scientists would just say that that's different life experiences impeding on the brain as it's growing, and so the brain forms a little differently in each person, even if they have the same genetics.
Because scientists, I know I study a little bit about scientists, because most of them are focusing, Western scientists, they're most focusing on understanding external world. But when it comes to inner world, especially consciousness, they have a very little knowledge.
It's true. In fact, up until recently, it wasn't even considered kosher to talk about consciousness in scientific circles.
Right. I heard some occasion, His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, he mentioned very a critical a point. He said the understanding about consciousness for the Western scientists is just in under kindergarten level.
At a kindergarten level. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think they would dispute that, because it's considered to be a great mystery, particularly because when you look at the language of science, which is typically mathematical, and it describes the relationship between things in the external world, it is extremely difficult to see how the redness of red, the taste of coffee, what it might be like to be a bat, it's extremely difficult to understand how you could even capture that, how you could even begin to explore that in the language of physics and mathematics, for example.
They not only have the theory backed about consciousness, for the Western scientists, they also have no implication at all. So now they borrow the idea of mindfulness meditation. They borrow the idea of insight meditation, into the West to study about consciousness. And this is different from the Buddha. He have a very clear theory about consciousness, and also he have an implication like meditation, mindfulness meditation, insight meditation as a technique to study the most subtle thing, which is called consciousness. But let's come back to the point about his critical question about the main cause of birth for Prince Siddhartha, and then he tried to find the answer from everyone inside his cycle, but he could not get any satisfying answer. Eventually, one day, he saw ascetic monks sitting alone and meditate intensively. And then he thought, wow, this man will know the answer about the main cause of birth. But you have to check your head in order to become ascetic monk. You have to check your head to live your to live a king palace. Unless so, you will not get any answer, because you have to have your wives, your kids, and so on. So the way to get the answer about the main cause of birth, you should leave the king palace and become a wandering monk like me, shave my head, do experimentation about yourself, and do experimentation by yourself. And then he quit the palace, and according to the story, has spent 6 years consecutively to find the main cause of birth. Because without birth, no aging. Without aging, no death.
So it's safe to say then that he wasn't satisfied with the more materialistic explanations of the cause of birth. And so he turned to consciousness to sort of understand. Now, we will hopefully in the future talk more specifically about consciousness, which I'm really looking forward to.
Right. And then this is the most remarkable finding. He found that the main cause of birth is coming from consciousness. It's a very wonderful idea, but in order to prevent death and dying, you have to understand your own consciousness in all aspects. Unless so, you will not be able to stop yourself from death and dying. And even and now you look in the West, no matter how great, how advanced scientists do in terms of physical science, in field of medication and physician, nobody can stop from death and dying now.
There's some people like Ray Kurzweil who believe that he might have reached the escape velocity to avoid death with our current medical innovations. But we'll see.
We'll see. We'll see. So if that will be the case, I will leave my lobes and become his disciple.
I think a lot of people would. Well, that's interesting because when we think about consciousness with respect to birth, one of the things we ask in the West oftentimes is, well, at what stage does consciousness kind of like enter the head of the baby, right? At what age do you become conscious? Are you conscious prior to birth in some fundamental way that is very different than the sensory consciousness we experience growing up? But we tend to get this idea that consciousness starts at the very least in a very minimal way, and then gradually becomes more robust, more filled out or colorful or rich, as a person grows up. So for a Western mind to think about consciousness being the cause of birth, it seems to put the cart before the horse. It seems to get things backwards, right? Birth happens first, and then consciousness follows as the brain matures. So
I think that's the most Western scientists believe. They believe the brain comes first and consciousness comes afterward.
Right.
And this is the opposite idea with a contemplative tradition like Buddhism. Buddhism believe consciousness comes first and the brain comes after.
So if that's the case, then surely Buddhists understand that children have different consciousness.
You have to make a different kind of consciousness. The first kind of consciousness is consciousness related to sensory experiences, related to physical body.
Okay.
So in this kind of consciousness, maybe is compatible with Western scientists. This kind of consciousness arising from the brain first, and then you have this kind of consciousness, because this kind of consciousness relates with a physical body. This is the first kind of consciousness, according to a Buddhist perspective. But there is also another kind of consciousness which is totally different from
sensory consciousness.
Yes, from sensory level, from the brain level. For example, the consciousness of dying people who already leave out the body. So in this time, is that kind of consciousness is a very, very a distinction from the brain. So before being come to the world, there is some kind of consciousness which is independently from the brain.
Okay,
And this kind of consciousness, according to Buddhist perspective, is the main cause of birth. But when the consciousness already come to stay in a fetus, in the egg and the sperm, when consciousness already come to stay there, and in that time, consciousness interconnected with the physical body immediately. So I think what scientists can measure is just consciousness related to the brain, but scientists cannot measure the consciousness beyond the brain.
That's interesting, because when we tend to think about the mystery of consciousness, even from a Western scientific perspective, when we say, well, what is it we're trying to explain? What is consciousness? It's not just being awake. It's not just being responsive. It's the what it's like to be a living being, to have the redness of red. Oftentimes people talk about qualia, like the redness of red, or the particular taste of coffee. There's nowhere in the atomic structure of the world is embedded the taste of coffee. That's something that happens sort of in interaction, but you can imagine that happening completely in the dark, so to speak. You can imagine a robot sensing the chemicals in coffee and being able to give you a readout of it. But you wouldn't expect that there would be something it was like to be that robot actually having that, that coffee or whatever. Whereas there's something that's like for us, but that's very sensory still though, right? So I don't know that we have a concept of consciousness, of anything beyond, like that seems to be the most inexplicable thing, is the sensory consciousness. We can find neural correlates. We can say, well, when we're conscious of this, we have brain activities of certain types, right? But there's no explanation as to why that brain activity should taste or smell like something, right? So that is kind of where the mystery is for the West. And there's what other kind of consciousness is there, right? Like this is, I think, what they would want to ask.
If you look in the Western scientist history, of course they should have no idea about that, because they have no concept, and they have no concept about meditation. They have no concept about mindfulness in comparison with the Buddha. So he studied consciousness by using the what he called mindfulness meditation, insight meditation, as a way to understand the whole aspect of consciousness. So in order to understand something beyond the brain or biological factors, you need to have the right way to understand. But for scientists, they have no idea about meditation. I mean, before they're just using what you call material, the technology based on the matter.
Yeah, all of our technology to investigate the world is based upon enhancing the senses.
Right, but
that's how we do our science.
Right, but the concept about consciousness is more subtle than that. It's beyond. I believe, my personal belief is beyond technology to detach. So you need to use your own mind to become technology, such as you have to train your mind until you have more clear mindfulness. You have more clear state of focusing, so that you can, understand the whole behavior of consciousness.
There was another thing that happened in the West too, around the time of the famous American psychologist William James, where he was doing a lot of introspective reporting, so kind of looking inside, so to speak, and reporting those experiences. And there, a lot of people started doing that, and then their reports became so unlike one another, right?
Yeah,
That it was decided that that you couldn't possibly have an objective science based upon this radically different subjective experience. So eventually, that was just disallowed, right, as evidence, as the thing on which to do science. And that spawned behaviorism, which then was all about just looking at the behaviors of people and animals. But in European philosophy, there was the phenomenologists who did kind of an introspection in a particular way. But I'm going to guess that the failures of the sort of William James style introspectionism was just because they didn't have the technology of meditation to do it properly.
No,
is that right?
They are not. They just do for fun. They don't dedicate the whole energy like the Buddha. He spent 6 years consecutively, to do experimentation about consciousness. But for introspectionisms, as you mentioned, they just do for one occasion and left.
Right.
I feel as a Buddhist monk, they do just for fun.
Right. They're just dipping their toe in the water and walking away.
Not walking away. But actually, and so it seemed to me that I feel in that time, they have no idea of meditation.
That's true.
They have no idea of training the mind as the way to understand consciousness. They have, you know, I assume people who come to study with them, they are bombarding with many different kind of thought, thinking, and so on. And then they try to look at their consciousness, how it's going to work, because they are still bombarding with stress, worry, concern, anxiety, and you have nowhere to see consciousness.
That's true. And even just interest, right? They just have an interest in psychology. So those thoughts, those theories will always be going around in your head.
Right. According to Buddhist perspectives, because consciousness is a very crucial issue in human life. So for people who study consciousness very seriously, not only they do in this lifetime, they're done in many previous lifetime.
Okay, we're going to get to that because that's very germane to death and dying, is reincarnation.
Right. But for introspectionism, they just do, I think 1 year, 2 years, 1 year, 2 years, and left. And I say, no, nothing happened. I haven't seen anything.
Right. Or if I did see something, it's not something that I can get other people to also see in the same way, right?
Right.
So tell me, if the consciousness that causes birth is not a sensory consciousness, do you have any way of characterizing it such that we might understand?
Based on his critical question, and for the prince Siddhartha Gautama, and then eventually he left king family to seek the answer for the main cause of the birth, in order to prevent from death. And then he has spent 6 years consecutively to look investigation about his own consciousness in very deeper level. And then he found a mechanism, some kind of mechanism in consciousness, which is called birth, aging, and death. And what he found, he called one is ignorance. Ignorance is the cause, is the one of main cause of birth. Another main cause of birth is the desire. One he called desire is one mechanism in consciousness. And another main cause, not a single main cause, but many main cause. One, ignorance. The second, desires. The third, what he called karma. He called karma or action. And the last one, attachment or clinging. So this is the four main cause of birth, aging, and death. So he can remove if he can remove all of this negative emotion from consciousness, and no more birth, no more aging, no more death. This is, and then he say, how I'm going to remove this kind of mental mechanism. And then he come up with the idea of meditation, mindfulness meditation, insight meditation, and he come with the idea of ethics, and and so on, like that.
Okay, let's talk a little bit more about karma as one of those causes, because I know that that's something that I think is very misunderstood in the West. Typically in the West, we think about, well, we have a lot of memes, for example, like if somebody is really angry and nasty, and then they, step on a rake and it flies up and hits their face or something, we'll say like, oh, instant karma, right? We have this idea of you're getting what you deserve, like a universal justice. That's kind of how the notion of karma works in the West, partly because that's kind of how it's perceived in Christianity in a lot of cases, right? It's like what you do in your life sort of stacks up as like a scorecard almost. And then where you go after you die is based upon whether or not, you're under or over par, essentially, to use a golfing metaphor. But I think that karma is much different than that in Buddhism, isn't it? I mean, there's similarities, I believe, but it's different.
From what I heard from you, some similar. Some similar it is. But one thing which is you need to understand when mentioned about the concept of karma, actually the karma means action.
It means action.
Action, but not only physical action, but also mentally action and verbally action. So say you think something that's already karma exists, or you say something, also you create karma, and not only physical action, but also mentally and verbally. And also we have the idea of result of karma, result of the action. So the concept of karma, including action and result.
Interesting. So karma is the action, the physical action plus the mental action plus the result of those actions.
Yes, that's the concept of karma in one concept.
Would it be fair to say that if karma is like a scorecard, would it be fair to say that the scorecard is a person's own mind rather than something outside of their mind?
From Buddhist perspective, what you mentioned about scorecard it seems to me is similar to the result of our own action. It's the result of our karma.
Interesting. So now
based on this, it's very crucial when the people are approaching death or dying, because in that moment, say a physical body no longer works, only according to Buddhist perspective, consciousness remains in that time. And what you are going to experiencing is the result of your action you done before. We come to your consciousness in that time, and then the most powerful result of your action will lead you to next destination according to Buddhist perspectives. So
let me tie this quickly back to what you said at the very beginning, because you were talking about death being like a final exam, and I think this is what you're talking about, right? Is that the moment of death, there's something about that has to do with how you've lived your life.
Exactly.
And at that moment, so it's not like it's not necessarily like a scorecard that, you know, has been kept independently of your mind, and
No.
that at the moment of death, it doesn't matter what state of mind you're in, right? But it actually matters what state of mind you're in. And the whole reason that karma is important for death and what happens at death is because all those aggregate compounding experiences of thoughts, of actions, of everything in your whole life will condition the state of mind that you're in at that moment. And that's why it's important. Right? I think that's a very subtle distinction, but I think it's super important because Western minds don't tend to work that way.
Similar to, I think it's similar to you go to final exams for your education. So in a final exam, you just take probably 1 hour and 2 hours, some people. And then what information you use to do exam is come from the whole year you study. It doesn't come from anywhere else. It's come from what you done.
Right.
It's come from how you perform in your classroom, in your class.
Now, is it possible? So some people are really brilliant, right? This might be stretching the metaphor a little too far, but what if they never show up to class? They don't do their homework. They perform really poorly generally. But the night before the exam, they read the entire textbook and remember it all and go to the exam and just ace it. Just do really, really well. Is there anything comparable to that?
That can happen, maybe because in previous lifetime, they used to study. In this lifetime, they just become lazy. But when they go to a final exam, they can remember their previous life. So
okay. So that is actually possible. Yeah, and this is how it differs, but this is how it differs from the scorecard idea, right? Or like, you know, I don't know a lot about ancient Egyptian theology, but you know, the story goes that your heart is weighed, you know, at the end, and if you're pure of heart, you can go on to the good place, and if you're not, you go to the bad place or something, right?
And so, I need to mention a little bit about what you mentioned about scorecard.
Right. Okay.
For people like, and when you mentioned about some people don't do well on some students don't do well on the class and so on, lazy, and then can get a good mark in final exam. That's possible. It also in terms of some dying person, because when they are facing dying in that crucial time, most of people consciousness open to many dimensions, even briefly, because in that time, before consciousness leave physical body, in that time, they will experience some kind of a phenomenon of luminosity of consciousness. In that specific time, some people may be able to recall previous lifetime and recall what they done in previous lifetime, and because of that, even though they are very poor in this lifetime, they don't do any good thing in this lifetime, but they can recall some good deed in previous lifetime, and because of that, it can condition that person destination. It can bring them to a higher realms, higher dimensions.
Interesting. So let's mention real quick first that like we have to delve into Buddhist cosmology a little bit here, insofar as there is this idea of different dimensions, of different hierarchies of being. Everything, and you can have like godlike figures, and then of course down to very lowly type consciousness. So when you die, you can, as your mind or as your consciousness is leaving the sensory body, you have however brief access to some of these other realms sometimes. Is that right?
According to say contemplative tradition like Buddhism. Actually, before this consciousness is going to leave this physical body, your sensory levels will dissolve first, such as the ability of seeing things will gone, the feeling in your nose, your mouth, your ears, the ability to hear will, physical body will gone, and eventually whole body will lose consciousness. You will not, the body will not no longer have any feeling. In that crucial moment, only consciousness remains.
So what is it about good karma that allows you to, I guess you said something about choosing your destination. So first of all, that's something to notice, is that there's destinations available after you die for your consciousness. But second of all, there's an ability to choose if your mind is conditioned properly. Is that right?
Can you hear?
I can now, yes.
And for the process of dying, you have to understand that first of all, the whole physical sensation will gone. Actually, when you still have the physical sensation, like eyes still working, your nose still working, your ears still working, your karma, which is your dant in this lifetime and previous lifetime, will not fully come to lead your consciousness. But whenever your dying person lose conscious about physical body, just a consciousness remain in that time, and that consciousness will open itself to every kind of karma they done, and also will open what to call themselves to see a destination, to go. I don't know whether
here's a tricky question. So if I'm curious about how we individuate consciousness when we no longer have a point of view. So we tend to think about a point of view like a perspective as being, we're here and we have a relationship with the next world or whatever, by virtue of our senses. We're looking from a point of view, we're hearing from a particular point in space. Now, if we give up the bodily sensations, the senses and all that kind of stuff, does a point of view remain somehow? Can you say it's a single consciousness anymore?
No, in that moment, not only single consciousness, but mental factors, because you have to make a distinction between consciousness and mental factors, such as the feeling is one of mental factors. So in terms of death and dying, you have to make a distinction, three different things in that moment. One, the brain or physical body. Second, consciousness. The third is mental factors such as memory, feeling, and so on. So in that time, even though dying people losing the sensation, a whole sensation of physical body, but consciousness and mental factors still remains. Not single consciousness. But maybe from a Christian perspective, only single souls or single consciousness.
Yeah, exactly. That's tends to be the Western perspective born of Christianity. Even our science is kind of dualistic in a sense, right? Owing to Descartes, which was a sort of a religious interpretation of the body versus the soul. There was always this distinction, this dichotomy in reality between the physical and the spiritual. And the spiritual was related with mind and consciousness, and the
Right.
body was just its vehicle, and at some point they would separate, and consciousness, and I think it's typically understood, like people, I think when they think about going to heaven or something, they think about their experience continuing in a visual, audio, olfactory sense, right? But just somehow just becoming separate from the body. Now, of course, a lot of scientists don't believe that, because any of those sensory modalities are tied so deeply with our transducers, our sensors, and the brain. So that jives a little bit better with Buddhism in that respect, because Buddhism says, when you die, all those sensory things, they go away. But there's still a mental factor. Now, what I said earlier about the neural correlates of consciousness, how if somebody's thinking something, we can at least see activity in the brain. So it would be hard for us to accept that mental factors could continue, because mental factors are so closely tied to the workings of the brain. Does that make sense?
Yes, from Western scientists, it's very difficult. And I say they have no idea about mindfulness meditation, no idea about insight meditation, to directly to see consciousness in the first place when they leave the body. So it's of course it's very difficult for them.
And then when we're dying and our consciousness has the opportunity to go elsewhere, what happens in that moment?
As I said, after the physical body gone, not only single consciousness leave, but also is leave with a structure. Is leave like a structure, which is also have a mental factors with that consciousness. That consciousness have a feeling, have a memory, have a thoughts within that consciousness. So and then where to regard to your point, where consciousness go is very, very difficult to know. But if you are Christianity, single question: if you believe, you go to the heaven. If you are non-believe, you go to another way, which is more suffering. But from a Buddhist perspective, the destination of dying person is very diverse. According to Buddhist cosmology, it's mentioned about 36 realms of being.
36 realms of being.
Of beings. We can divide in 3 different levels of realms. The first is lowest realms, which is the realm of suffering, like animals, hungry ghosts, health. The second realm is the middle, which is mixing between happiness and suffering, like human being is considered to be human realms.
So we exist in the middle of the 36.
Middle realm, and the third realms is considered to be higher realms, which is more happiness, such as the realms of a deity, God, and so on. I mean, within 36 realms of being in this universe, we can divide in 3 different levels: lowest, middle, and highest. So it's hard to say when that person die and leave the body. It's hard to say where they go, which realm they go. It's depend upon what they done in this lifetime. It's depend upon their karma.
But because it shapes their mind in that moment, is that right?
Yes. You mean in the moment of dying?
Correct.
Yes. It's the moment of dying is very crucial. So that time is very crucial. It's similar to the time you go to the final exams. Whether you do well or not depend upon what you perform in
And
that
if your
moment.
mind is a mess, if you're full of fear, if you're full of resentment or hate or whatever, you're just going to be such a jumble that you won't be able to navigate to a good place. Is that right? Oh, I think you might have just cut out. Can't hear your audio.
You hear me now?
Yes.
So if dying person is bombarding with the stress, anxiety, nervous concern, and so on, because he never well prepared, he never think about that and dying, they have more potential to go to reborn in a lower realms, such as the realm of animals, hungry ghosts, and hell. But if they train the mind and they will well prepare, they have a more potential to be reborn in a higher realm. So it depends on the quality of their mind in that moment. What kind of destination they go, it depends on the quality of the mind.
Now, is that because they can make a choice if their quality of mind is good?
Again, like you do a final exam again, it depends on your choice or
well, let's
what
say
else?
I passed the final exam.
Right.
And
Say
they're like,
you-
okay, so here's your diploma. You can do now what you want to do. Am
Right.
I bound for graduate school, or can I choose to go and live in the street or go to graduate school? Right.
It depends on your choice.
It does depend on your choice. And that's why it's necessary to have a clear mind.
Right. What you done in that time.
Interesting.
It depends on your performance. So, but from a Buddhist perspective, is that it depend on good. It depend on quality of your mind. The quality of your mind is the thing that can decide whether you have a good destination or bad destination. In other words, depend on yourself.
Why would the Buddha choose to escape the cycle of rebirth and death, as opposed to just being content with being in the godly realms of happiness?
Because, according to a Buddhist perspective, whether you are reborn in
Oh, I lost you again.
hello.
Yes, there you go. Okay, so why would the Buddha choose not to be just reborn into the godly realms and be happy, but rather get off the train altogether?
Whether you would be born in lowest realm, middle realms, or higher realm, or more happy realms, according to Buddhist psychology. At the end of the day, when life expectancy in that realms end, you will be subject of
The
rebirth
final
again.
exam again.
Right.
You have to write the exam again.
Suppose you wouldn't be born in lowest realm, like in the realm of animals. There is like expectancy in that realm, not forever. Or you wouldn't be reborn in the hungry ghost realms.
The hungry
There is
ghost
a
realms.
there is certain life expectancy. This is different from Christianity. If you are reborn in the kingdom of God forever,
Right.
and then if you miss,
That's it.
you also gone for a horrible realm forever. So that is not the case. That is not the case from Buddhist cosmology. Every kind of realms have a certain life expectation So certain life expectancies.
Does that mean gods can die?
Oh yes, not forever. So that's why the Buddha say, well, in order to prevent from die again, so you have to um, to remove all level of ignorance, all level of desire and clinging and karma. So that's what he come with the idea of non-self. Only understanding the idea of non-self will allow you get exit from all cycle of birth and death.
Interesting. I was actually going to ask you that as my final question. I thought that there was a tension between
But
the doctrine of non-self and reincarnation, because like if you don't have a self, what is there to reincarnate?
but you have to, yes, right, that's a good point. So that you have a good point. In order to escape from the cycle of birth, aging, and death, not only as human being, also in the realms of animals, also in the realm of deity and God, you have to understand the concept of non-self. If
And
you
it's understanding that helps you get off the cycle.
Oh yes, because to understand the concept of non-self, no more self, no more existing.
Would you? Oh, I just got it. So that's why ignorance is considered a cause of birth.
Right.
Is because if you're ignorant of the fact that you don't have a self or are not a self, of not like a unified thing, then and because your mental factors survive death, even after you die, you will be clinging still to the ideas of a self.
Right.
And that will cause the rebirth in a way.
Again, right? Yes, again. Right.
Oh, interesting. Okay. I'm starting to get it now, I think.
so that's why he, as I mentioned, he tried to seeking the answer for solution of death and aging and birth. Eventually, he found the Buddha. He found that until you understand the concept of non-self, and then you will be able to get exist from the cycle of birth, aging, and death. Unless so, you will be subject to be reborn and again in many different roles, endless.
Right. So would I be correct in saying then that the purpose of meditation and mindfulness is to condition your mental factors such that when that moment of death comes, you're not clinging, you're not trying to preserve an illusory self, but rather you can just let it go, and in some sense you just dissipate because you're not clinging, you're not trying to keep going.
And that's what we call enlightened being, a person who attained nibbana.
Well, that is incredibly interesting, Ajarn. I think that's a very actually, subtle system.
Right, but actually what we talk about death and dying just for normal people, not for enlightened being.
Right.
For enlightened being or a person who attained nibbana, they already have no idea. They know that they already know their destination. They already understand the concept of non-self. So we cannot teach them. They should teach us.
Right, right. Ajarn, thank you so much for answering these questions. Is there any other thing that we haven't touched upon that we should about this topic?
I think that's it. That is very wonderful talking.
Well, Kap Kun Krap, thank you so very much.
You can make a summarization in the past, in the last part of our talk, because people can have a clear idea about what we are talking.
I would very much enjoy doing that. Yeah, because I had a bit of an aha moment, a little realization here while we were talking. So I would love to write that down at some point. So we'll look for that on the temple's website.
Thank
on
you.
Facebook, the Facebook page. Ajahn
Thank you.
Much
Thank
metta.
you.